everyone, welcome back to Nails Before Films. Finally, my last review for 2023. Woohoo! For me, the number one movie last year was undoubtedly Oppenheimer. I watched this film twice in IMAX, and the ticket for my second watch was only $5 because it was National Cinema Day in Canada. That must have been one of the most blessed moments of my life. I got to watch Oppenheimer in IMAX twice, and I got a decent seat at a low price. Now, my review of this movie is going to be somewhat biased because history, science, politics, and war have always interested me, and this movie has them all. I actually wanted to see Oppenheimer when I saw its trailer in theaters back in May, before Barbenheimer was a thing. I studied math for my undergrad. I've always liked physics more than chemistry, and war movies fascinate me. So a film about the Manhattan Project was straight up my alley. After watching it, Oppenheimer turns out to be so much more than a war movie about the atomic bomb. I'm Taiwanese and we love our politics, so I find the political aspects of this movie equally fascinating. Also, as someone who took a philosophy course despite being in math and business, the themes and dilemmas that were explored throughout this film are extremely thought-provoking. To be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Christopher Nolan, so the reason why I like Oppenheimer is not because it's a Christopher Nolan film. I've only watched 7 of his movies, and 3 of them were Batman. Besides Batman, I've only watched The Prestige, Dunkirk, Tenet, and Oppenheimer. I've never watched Inception or Interstellar. Out of the 7 movies I watched, I liked most of them. The 3 Batman movies were fine. Of course, Dark Knight is the best. The first one is a bit boring, and the last one is messy. But they are still enjoyable enough, and I do think they changed how audiences view superhero films. The Prestige is pretty good. I don't have anything bad to say about it. It's smaller in scale compared to his later films, but that's why it worked. The story isn't that convoluted, just 2 magicians trying to find out each other's secrets and exact revenge. The twists are straightforward but effective. If you're not a fan of Christopher Nolan's overly complicated movies, this one is a nice, simple mystery thriller. Next, I like Dunkirk. It's a good war movie, but I can't say it left an impression on me. I've only watched the movie once. I remember enjoying it, but I fail to remember anything specific about it. It just feels like a typical war movie, and there really wasn't anything that wowed me. I might watch it again someday, but that's my impression of it at this moment. Lastly, Tenet. I really don't like Tenet. Before watching it, I saw a lot of people praising it, saying it was mind-blowing, smart, and amazing. So I went in with high hopes but came out utterly confused. I have no idea what the story is about, and I feel like it's complicated for the sake of being complicated. I fail to remember anything about this movie except that it's about time travel. Robert Pattinson is in it, and the protagonist's name is just the protagonist. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of Tenet. Call me stupid if you want, but the movie is just not for me. While I mostly enjoyed Christopher Nolan's movies, I can't help but feel like he does his best work when adapting existing stories, especially history. Because of how confused and disappointed I was after watching Tenet, in which Christopher Nolan wrote the story, I was blown away by how grounded and beautiful Oppenheimer was. It really shows that oftentimes good stories already exist. You just need to find the right way to adapt them. And I absolutely believe that Christopher Nolan did so with Oppenheimer. It's amazing how he was able to take something niche, in this case a biopic about a World War II scientist, and turn it into something general audiences can enjoy. It's artistic, educational, philosophical, and most importantly, thrilling. I do believe that without Barbenheimer, the film wouldn't do as well as it did. While I didn't like Barbie, I have to thank it for bringing more people to see Oppenheimer. I do think it deserves the success. I would love to see more movies like this, something that inspires audiences to reflect on the world we live in, ponder the nature of humanity, and contemplate where we want to go. Honestly, I don't have any complaints about Oppenheimer, so I'm going to go through some common issues people have with the movie and why I'm personally okay with them. Just a reminder, it's completely fine if you don't like this movie and disagree with my opinions. I'm just sharing why these things aren't problems for me, but it's completely justified if they are problems for you. I understand that this movie is not for everyone and some people might find it overrated, confusing, and boring. I'm simply explaining why that's not the case for me. Alright, I've talked long enough. Let's actually get into the movie. First of all, some people find it confusing. Christopher Nolan has this kink of telling stories non-linearly, and it could induce confusion. Personally, I didn't find this a problem. It's obvious that there are three parts to the story: Oppenheimer's past, his security hearing, and Strauss's hearing. It's quite clear which one was happening when I was watching the film, so I don't find it difficult to follow. However, I will say that it helps if you know beforehand the rough history. When I watched Oppenheimer for the first time, I purposefully went in blind. I knew about the Manhattan Project, but that was basically it. I had no idea about Oppenheimer's hearing, and I certainly didn't know who Strauss was. I wanted to see if someone who knew basically nothing about this part of history could enjoy the film. And while I think you can, the experience would be much better if you could follow along. During my first watch, I wasn't sure what the hearings were about, and that did make me a bit confused at times. I still enjoyed the movie, but it was a bit difficult to stay focused while trying to piece together the information given throughout the film. After watching it for the first time, I went home and did my research. As a result, I was less distracted during my second watch because I could follow along smoothly this time. I no longer had to try and make sense of what was happening and could simply enjoy what was presented on screen. I'm a big fan of non-linear storytelling when done right, as I said in my Poker Night video. It creates suspense and engages the audience. In Oppenheimer's case, I was hyper-focused throughout my first watch because I was learning everything for the first time, and there's fun in that. But knowing the rough history beforehand does make the film more digestible. I'm a bit conflicted about this because I'm against having people do homework before watching a movie. You should be able to present the audience with a coherent movie even if they don't know anything about the subjects, or else it's not a great film. However, for Oppenheimer, I think the movie is enjoyable even if you know nothing about Oppenheimer, but having that knowledge would heighten the experience. Next, some people think the movie is boring. This is understandable. The most exciting thing that happened in the film was Trinity, and after that it was mostly political drama, which could be somewhat dry. But because I find political drama interesting, I was intrigued by the hearings. For me, it's not enough to portray the rise of Oppenheimer. His downfall is equally important. It's disheartening to see that someone who contributed as much as Oppenheimer got punished for having an opinion that was not in line with the government's. And the part where they kept labeling him as a commie and therefore a spy hits too close to home for me. As a Taiwanese, there was a time in our history when our government was extremely anti-communist, so much so that they would label people as CCP spies and execute them for just reading books on communism, most of the time without proper trials. Can you imagine that? Getting killed by your government just because you read a book? My dad even had a relative who was executed because he was part of a book club that read books on communism. So when I saw that the US government did this to someone as prominent and decorated as Oppenheimer, it made me extremely emotional, which is also why I think it's important to show Oppenheimer's downfall. People have been wronged and people are still being wronged just because they have a different opinion, because they refuse to conform. We need to remember the people who suffered and never go down that road again. I actually cried after Einstein said to Oppenheimer, "Just remember, it won't be for you, it would be for them." It's cruel but true. We try to compensate the people who have been wronged in the past, but most of the time it's not for them. Lives have been ruined and nothing could ever make up for that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't compensate these people, just that it doesn't mean everything is okay and we should never forget. Sorry if this video is getting a bit heavy, but Oppenheimer is a heavy film. Because of how thought-provoking it was for me, I couldn't find the movie boring. Yes, it is very fascinating to see how Oppenheimer rose to power, how the atomic bomb was built, and how World War II ended because of it. However, it's also important to show the impact of such a weapon had on the world, the never-ending conflict of men, and the casualties of such conflicts. Instead of going out with a bang with Trinity, which was the highlight of the film for most people, I highly appreciate the movie spending time to explore these topics through Oppenheimer's life after the Manhattan Project. The first half of the movie was about the physical horror of such a weapon, and the second half was about the horror of men. The weapons are most dangerous when these two are combined, and frankly, I would argue that men who use these weapons of mass destructions are more terrifying than the weapons themselves. Besides these two things, I think people mostly agree that Oppenheimer was a visually stunning, well-acted movie. The visual effects were absolutely amazing. Everyone in the theater held their breath when Trinity happened. Without a doubt, the casts were all very talented. Cillian Murphy did an exceptional job as Oppenheimer. However, speaking of the cast, I do have one criticism for this movie. There are way too many people, and most of them aren't properly introduced. It's nearly impossible to remember all of the scientists' names, and I would prefer the movie actually tell us who they are and what they contributed to the Manhattan Project. Most of them are just there. We don't know their expertise and why they are significant, which is a shame because they were all very important people who contributed so much to science. We don't even know some of their names. You're supposed to magically know who they are. It's a bit frustrating if you look into it and discover how significant these people were. Many of them won Nobel Prizes, for goodness sake. I know the movie is already 3 hours long and I appreciate them putting so many scientists in it, but we don't really know anything about them after watching the film. While I was okay with the movie's pacing, I was never bored. I would prefer they speed up some parts or cut out some stuff so that we can learn more about these scientists. This was a great chance to introduce these people, yet we ended up learning nothing about them. As for the story, it is fairly accurate, which is always a good thing for biopics. There are only small discrepancies, like Oppenheimer didn't bring the calculations to Einstein. While some things are made up or glossed over for dramatic effect, the general history is accurate. Most importantly, it spiked people's interest in the subject, which is very admirable. Lastly, I like how this movie tends to stay neutral on the controversy surrounding Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb. It never truly condemns the US government for bombing Japan, but from the way Oppenheimer feels guilty afterward, they didn't make it seem like the right thing to do either. Some people criticized it for not showing the damage the bombs did to Japan, but I understand why they didn't. It would be easy for the audience to think that they shouldn't have dropped the bombs if we saw how inhumane it was. But it wasn't so cut and dried in real life. On one hand, it did end World War II and may have saved more lives than it killed. On the other, it did kill a lot of people, polluted the environment, and might have changed the world for the worse. Personally, I think it is what it is. It's not right or wrong, just something we have to live with. There could have been a better way to end the war, but there could also be outcomes much worse than the atomic bombs. As for the movie's portrayal of the conflict between people who advocated for international arms negotiation and people who find the arms race necessary, the movie doesn't really say which one is better, and I understand both of their perspectives. It's true that the arms race isn't a good thing, and humans will likely destroy themselves if this keeps going on. However, it is dangerous to believe in negotiations as well. It's highly likely that some people will go behind your back and develop these weapons. Do we really want to risk some psychos having these bombs but we don't? I don't know, both options are scary. One, we have a fragile balance that would destroy the world once broken. And the other, we have to risk someone developing weapons in secrecy and using it against us. The movie didn't try to convince you to side with Oppenheimer, in my opinion, and it encouraged me to come up with my own conclusion. That's basically my thoughts on Oppenheimer. I do think it's a masterpiece, but I completely understand why some people believe it's overrated. If it weren't for my background and interests, it's highly possible that I wouldn't find the movie as enjoyable. But objectively, it is a very well-made film that provides the audiences with a unique experience. I definitely consider it Christopher Nolan's best film, at least out of the 7 that I've watched. Hope my nails did the beautiful visuals in this movie justice. I picked the scenes that made an impression on me or are significant to the film. As always, like, subscribe, comment, share, do what you want. Keep nailing it and don't be the destroyer of worlds, people.